I Barely Got Here is a collection of stories and conversations based on 24 years in law enforcement. You have the right to be disturbed by some of the content or disagree with the viewpoints. Anything you hear can and will be dosed with sarcasm and dark humor. You have the right to know that discussions will often be graphic with language and themes that are intended for a mature audience. Do you understand your rights? Then buckle up, Buttercup. We're going 10-8. Hello and welcome back to I Barely Got Here. I'm your host, Kevin Booncher. Tonight's episode, Social Sides. So as happens sometimes when I script out my stories, this kind of started out as a story about a ride-along, and it morphed into remembering encounters with friends and family and things, so just bear with me, I guess. Well, this is toward the very beginning of my career, not to mean I didn't have any friends or fun or socialize later in my career, but much of these memories are due in part to kind of where I was in life and being a uniformed patrol officer. I was thoroughly enjoying myself back then and feeling my way through as a shiny 21 and 22-year-old who hardly knew what he was doing some of the time. One of the funny or not so funny things about being that young in that job is all the bar interactions. So our city has a lot of bars. I mean, it's a college town. Back then, and I'm sure now, ASU had quite a reputation as a party school, so bars and clubs accordingly. I'd respond to calls at bars or clubs at least a couple times a night for what you would expect. Fights, fake IDs, DUIs, crash-ups in the parking lot, assaults, drunken lover spats, all the usual stupid/drunk people problems. Well, a lot of times I'd show up and I'd get a double take because I looked pretty young. And oftentimes I was younger than the victim or bar attendee or the bouncer that I happened to be dealing with. It was a little annoying at first, especially when people tease you about it, but pretty soon I was just another crusty old veteran and I didn't get that so much. Further on this, and more entertaining, probably for my friends, was when I'd bump into these guys at different places in the city. And many of them, and the friends of the friends, were going to college or they were college age, my age. So bouncing around the clubs in Tempe was a weekly event. An example would be, I'd be set up to watch a door at a particular club that we may be having trouble with. Well, I'd be watching to see how the doormen or the bar employees were managing their issues with different people, how they're checking IDs, various things that were going on. And obviously you'd just be BSing with the doorman in between these interactions. And part of it was kind of a planned objective, though, too, because you'd get to know these guys between talking to them and responding to these calls all the time. And the point was, it helped you to get to kind of know who was good, who wasn't so good, who you could quasi-trust, and who was probably part of the bigger problem. Well, this particular time was closer to closing, and a sergeant and another officer arrived to assist with the usual silliness that comes with all these drunks pouring out at the same time. I'm standing there trying to act professional, and who do I see coming out of this particular club? Well, it's a group of my friends. They're about 6 or 8 deep. I'm like, crap. So I tried to fade back so they don't see me because I've kind of been through this before, but it was too late. So they all start hearing boonch and kind of make their way toward me, happy and noisy like the rest of the people there. And then one of the group, a buddy of mine, Blake, who is still is one of my best friends, even though he's a hose dragger now, I've known him since high school. And he was also living with me, and he was going to ASU and working. But, he and I did a lot of stuff together back then. Well, whenever we have these little impromptu bump-ins out in the city, he was always good about making sure that anybody around knew that just the other night, we'd been there. Oh, we were just here, dude. Remember just last night? Isn't that funny? And, it was funny. You got to admit, it is kind of funny. And then he'd usually finish with some embellished story, which was embellished, sometimes a little accurate. Well, then the rest of the gang came over, and the girls are the worst, and they know what they're doing every time. They get all gushy, and they start hugging on you and pawing on you and, making a scene in front of whoever happens to be around. And, of course, they don't do that under normal circumstances, but everybody finds it pretty funny. Even my face is turning red a little bit, and I'm really not trying too hard to make them stop anyway. So I'm doing my best to faux push off these girls/friends, telling them that, hey, you can't be hugging on me because I'm working here. Everybody has a good time. There's no harm. Well, they kind of finish up, pile into their cars, and as I'm praying that they've done the designated driver thing, They head off to points unknown while I stay at work. And then the sergeant or the other officer would have fun talking about it for a while. Stuff like that happened from time to time. Never got too silly, never got me in trouble, and it was kind of fun. And that group of friends, they were pretty good folks, many of them that I still know now, and I enjoyed being around them, so it was fun to bump into them. And I did get back at a couple of them. There'd be times I'd be rolling around in my patrol car, and I'd recognize one of my friends' cars as they were driving through the city. So I'd get in behind them and pull them over. I'd give them a few chirps on the siren also just to draw more attention and amp them up a little bit more. Nobody likes getting pulled over by the cops, not even cops. It's just that universal ugh feeling when you see a marked unit hitting the overheads behind you. You'd think they'd have thought that it was me. A couple of them I'd pulled over more than once, but every time it's so funny because they would be sweating it until I got up to the window and leaned in with a big grin on my face. And thank goodness no one ever took off on me or did something silly. I think when you're a cop, your friends get a kick out of encounters like that because it's just such a difference in dynamic from when you're working and you're wearing that uniform and you're doing that job. And then when you're just normal you going out and, running to Mexico and just having fun. But that is one of those weird things about being a cop too. The change that takes place, it's like that mental switch that changes from being off duty or away from work to being on duty and wearing that uniform, sometimes literally or figuratively. There's only one time messing with my friends like that I still look back and think, I shouldn't have done that one. Well, I had another good friend of mine, then and still now, Mike, who'd hit me up about going to this party at somebody's house. And the party happened to be, I don't recall if it was in my beat or in a beat right next to mine. Well, the party was just kind of a small gathering for him and a couple other people who had graduated from college that year. Well, I was working that night, so I had to decline, but he gets this funny idea. He's like, hey, why don't you come to the party while you're working and then come in and find me and arrest me? So I'm thinking, well, that does sound kind of funny. Again, we're always playing jokes and pranks on each other and doing funny stuff and silly stuff. And so it just kind of fell right in line with that. And the people at the party, I knew they'd recognize me, and you would think that they'd know that it was, bogus and fake. And of course, then I'd stop this arrest before it went too far. So I'm thinking, all right, why not? It sounds kind of fun. And I said, all right, I'll give it a shot if there's time during the shift. Well, partway through the shift, I go to that party. I knock on the door, and when the RP or the responsible person answers, I say, hey, I want to check on some occupants because I've heard that there's somebody there who's wanted, has a warrant. Well, that's the first problem. I really shouldn't have even done that, getting into the party. He allowed me in. I didn't force my way in, so it's not like I'm committing a crime or a rights violation, but still, and it's easy to see what a problem it was in hindsight. And, unlike most of the parties in the city, which at some point get a call or a complaint, we hadn't heard anything on this one yet. So I'm cruising through the party. There's maybe like 30, 35 people inside and kind of outside in the backyard. And I'm just like man on a mission, like focused, staring around, RoboCopping it. Well, I'm getting odd stares, of course. And there was that first twinge of, maybe I shouldn't be doing this. And even the couple of people that I knew seemed to kind of be unclear as to just what was going on because, I wasn't stopping to say hello and I really wasn't acknowledging them. But, I'd already committed, and the thought of arresting Mike was still playing funny in my head. So before I knew it, I was in the backyard and I saw my wanted person. Well, Mike sees me walking toward him, and at first he has to stifle the kind of that usual friendly greeting as he forgets why I came. Well, I beeline over to him and I make some Tommy Tough talk about his getting caught and spin him around and put cuffs on him. And he plays it off pretty well. Proverbial needle scratches across the record and the place goes quiet and everybody's just watching the show. So I start to roughly parade Mike back through the house and talking smack to him. And, people are just kind of watching with their mouths open, trying to figure out what the hell's going on. Well, thankfully, again, another thing, nobody intervened in this, as happens at times when you go to these house parties with, a lot of testosterone, alcohol, and that herd mentality. Because kind of had the exact same thing happen during a party I went to with another guy, and we go to arrest this guy, and things just went to crap on us. We got there, some guy shoved me in the chest for some reason, don't even recall, fight him a little bit, get him on the ground, and the next thing I know, another dude is like grabbed me in a bear hug from behind, and it just went to crap. It was, we're chasing people, we're fighting people, we're arresting people. It's just a big cluster. So, bring it back to this. It'd be pretty hard to explain to my sergeant that similar occurrence when it boiled down to the fact that I was arresting my own friend for nothing. Well, I get Mike to the front door and start to uncuff him, which is even more confusing to everyone. But he and I kind of laugh, we shake hands, and we just start, talking like normal. Well, people laugh, kind of that nervous laugh, as in, I'm still not really sure what's going on, and I really hope that this dude can't smell this weed in my pocket. I get introduced to some people, and everybody kind of starts to relax, and of course I'm offered alcohol, which I decline, and I settle in for just a couple of minutes of doing some PR, being officer friendly, giving legal advice to the usual silly questions, and, keeping an ear on the radio, just trying to put a human face on the uniform. Well, I'm not there 5 minutes when there's a bit of a commotion in the backyard. So Mike and I wander that way, and I see that there's a palm tree on fire. And it's not like a little fire at the base. It's not a barbecue. The trunk of this palm tree is on fire. Here's another point where I'm thinking, dude, you shouldn't even be here. Well, someone runs to get the garden hose and starts spraying it while I'm watching this tree fire grow and thinking of the options. What to do? I look at Mike, and he kind of gives me that look like, yeah, you probably should get out of here. And I'm pretty much, my feet are moving that direction when he's doing that. So I'm heading to the front door. I mean, there's not really, I'm not a hose dragger. I'm a cop. There's not much I can do. I don't have a fire extinguisher hanging off my belt. There's plenty of half-drunk folks that are pretty calmly, I have to say, working to put the tree fire out with their cups of beer or water, or some are bowls of water. Someone picks up the dog bowl and starts hucking it at the fire. Somebody calls 911, so that alleviated me from doing it over the radio, which again, just adds to the chain of events of why I'm there now. I'm like, oh, hey, by the way, there's a fire here. Well, luckily they did get the fire out before it got out of hand, but the hose dragger still showed up. And I'd kind of waited out front. I felt an obligation to stay and deal with any fallout if it did happen. And then obviously kind of keeping tabs on people and just making sure nobody got hurt. So I talked with the fire guys, and I just kind of let them assume that I was there on a regular party call. A couple of those guys walk to the backyard, confirm that the tree's put out, and then they clear. And like I said, I look back now and realize obviously it's not the smartest thing to do start to finish. But I'll blame that on Mike. He's kind of what I'd call a quiet instigator. And there were other occasions where you'd bump into people besides your friends, like, family or ex-girlfriends. And, those times could run the gamut from, oh, well, that was cool, that was nice, to, oh, my hell, I got to get out of here. Or, other cops would bump into you and say, oh, hey, I ran into so-and-so, and then you listen as you pray that they didn't make a fool out of themselves. It's not like cops normally bump into people under nice or pleasant circumstances, so you just kind of automatically assume that it may not end well. I remember one night we headed to a search warrant in another city for some dope investigation that we were chasing around town. And it was in an apartment complex, and we pulled in and we offloaded, and we started to quickly walk toward the target apartment, kind of in a line, and we're all geared up in our usual warrant clothes and helmet and shield and vests and weapons and the whole thing. Well, as we're walking through this courtyard, I see this younger guy that I recognize as one of my second cousins. He's a super nice kid. And he's watching this commotion, and as I get closer, he kind of has some recognition of my face. It's like he can place me, but he can't place me. And so I call out his name, and it was just kind of funny. He's still like, what is going on? And so I had to keep going, obviously, because I was running this warrant and we had a job to do. So I just smiled at him as we cruised by. Well, once we get done with the warrant, then there was a couple minutes, and I went back outside, and I found him still hanging out, with other people, because it's the show. People are watching the show and breaking doors and all that good stuff. And again, it's just funny, when people see you at work, even your family, versus that normal friend or family interaction at a gathering. And there'd be times you'd intervene during some incidents to try to help a family member or a friend of a friend. I can remember a number of phone calls where things were batted back and forth and discussed about just that. And I'm not talking about helping someone, escape or, for God's sake, hiding evidence or any crazy thing like that. For one thing, it's not worth jeopardizing your job. And for another thing, your integrity would be completely shot were you to do something like that. It doesn't make sense. It'd kind of be more like the time I came across a guy who was the big brother of a friend of mine from high school. And he was pounded, he was hammered, and he'd pulled his car to the side of the road and was just sitting there. Well, I pulled in behind him, not knowing who he was, and I made contact, and then I recognized him. And it took him a bit to recognize me because, again, such a different setting than when he used to pick on me and his brother a few years ago. And then, he's also looking at everything through his beer goggles. But eventually he does, and he's really embarrassed. And he said, hey, I realized I was drunk, and I just pulled to the side of the road and was trying to figure out what I should do. Well, technically, I could have arrested him for DUI, no question. He's in control of the vehicle, and any officer that did that would be well within reason. But, I kind of decided that I'd stick my neck out a bit for him that night, and I told him I could arrest him, and he agreed with that, and, that the way things were anymore, we almost always had to arrest DUI people because we had so many of those morons that would go back to their car and drive if we didn't lock them up for the night. Well, he'd kind of resigned himself to being arrested, and he just stood there waiting for it. I said, hey, lock your car and get in the back of my car. Well, he looks up, and, you'd think I just gave him $1 million. He jumps in there, and I drove him home, which wasn't very far. And I made sure to tell him that, if I find that you return to this car, I'll charge you with the first DUI, and then I'll make up some other charges to charge you with. Which, obviously, I can't do that, but it sounded good. So he swears he's not going to do that. And up until probably the last time I drove by that area and saw that car at about 4 a.m., it was still there. So he didn't break his promise. And, in the big scheme of things, I never really had any big issues like some cops do with friends or family while they're on the job. So I'm pretty thankful for that. So to the original story that I had started with, there's a program which I'm pretty sure still exists in some form where civilians could ride along with an officer. The intention is to allow the public to observe and witness what a patrol officer does over the course of a half or a full shift, depending on the person. Well, most cops don't really enjoy them for a few reasons. First, you don't want to be responsible for a civilian as they go about their shift. It's just another thing that you have to worry about in addition to everything else. You have to tell them what to do, where to go, when to stay in the car, give them bathroom breaks, when they can come with you, when they can't, got to keep them safe, etc., etc. And they're always there with you in your rolling office/patrol car. So during a normal course of business, you're going to be in your car alone. And it's the only place you can really get away from everything, even if it's just for a couple of minutes to decompress. And sometimes that involves yelling. At least for me it did. You're yelling at dispatch, you're yelling at other cops, you're yelling at the public, other drivers, and it goes on and on. It's not always necessarily deserved, of course. It's just a decompression. And as long as it took place within the confines, no one heard it and all's fine. Unless it's those couple of occasions where you kind of forgot that you had your windows down and then you got a little bit of creative explaining, apologizing to do. Well, with the ride-along, you shouldn't, and you can't do that. Or at least you do it much, much less and maybe a little bit under your breath. You had to watch how you represented the department. Because, you can't and you shouldn't badmouth your department in front of people or, really badmouth other employees or your boss or anything else to these poor folks on this ride-along because they don't really know what's going on anyway. And, of course, that's an easy thing to fall into. Trust me, cops and talking smack about everything in the world is pretty common. And I'm sure I did my share, but, you still need to try to keep it to a minimum. It just doesn't do anybody any good. Well, last, a ride-along cramps your ability to do work. there are certain limitations, such as how you can respond, or how and if you respond to a hot call. You can't be involved in vehicle pursuits, and a couple others. So if you are new, like I was then, and you're chomping at the bit to get involved in things, well, it doesn't go over so well. Now, some guys enjoyed them, or at least they tolerated ride-alongs. And a lot of times this would be your more senior men and women who had their share of all the madness and were fine with the inconvenience and the limitations. And honestly, some of them were really good at doing it. There's a couple officers I remember who would usually volunteer to do that, and they presented a great face for the department. And also those of us who didn't want to take them really appreciated those folks. I remember at the beginning of the briefings, the squad sergeant would say, "Hey, we got a ride along in the lobby, so who's going to take them?" And the shifts I worked mostly back then were usually pretty hard charging squads, so it was very common for no hands to go up and everybody to kind of just look around. Or you'd volunteer your friend, or vice versa. Well, some of the time there'd be a revolving order for us, and sometimes it was based solely on tenure. So it'd be, hey, new guy, gal, you're up. And all right, thanks, Sarge. And those night and weekend shifts that we were working were usually the ones that were requested for a ride along. Because first, most people work normal days and hours, and so those shifts work better for them to go. And second, everyone kind of assumes that those shifts are more active and that they see more action, which I do still think is pretty accurate for the most part. But, after a career's worth of time, you sure come to realize that day shifts have their share of crazy and dangerous incidents also. Well, when it came to ride-along, sometimes you'd send a scout to the lobby to get a look at who the person was. Not so much was it a pretty girl, or, well, maybe a little bit, but more to kind of see what the vibe of the person or the people were. I mean, is this someone who's going to be at least a little fun, or is it someone who looks like they're going to be analyzing everything and asking a million questions? They got a crap attitude, tons of hypothetical questions. I mean, kind of that kind of person. But sometimes that scout would intentionally bring back a false report so as to get someone like me to step up. And you learned who these deceptive people were quickly, and then they were not to be believed anymore. So if I was in the running, I'd usually go and make sure that I did my own scout, regardless of if there had been one already. But the bottom line was there weren't too many of them. And no matter if you wanted to or not, you always did your best to accommodate and make their time enjoyable and educational. I remember one where there was a couple of gals that came with me, and we had a good old time. The shift wasn't too busy, but there's enough to be entertaining and make the time go quick. And as with any ride-along, you'd always go through, kind of your personal rules and suggestions for them so that they knew what they could and couldn't do and what you wanted them to do. Well, the one thing that resonated with these two gals was the part where I said, if you hear gunshots, run away and don't worry about me. Now, of course, there's a lot more to it than that, but they thought that was just all kinds of funny. So over the shift, there would be a couple of calls where I'd tell them, okay, hey, stay by or in the car, and if you hear gunshots, and then they'd finish the sentence for me. I did tell them that, hey, you can't take my car, though, because I might need some of that stuff in there. So they realized they were hoofing it. A week or so later, I remember receiving a postcard from them thanking me for my time and letting them ride along. And then at the bottom of the card had kind of this little drawing and a statement about running from gunshots. And, I always thought that was really cool of them. And I think I've actually got that thing tucked away somewhere because I always just thought it was a nice gesture. Well, a ride-along could also be someone that you knew as well. So, like over the course of my time when I was in patrol, I remember I took my dad, I took a couple of friends, a couple gals that I was dating. I think it was probably about it. This was much simpler, as you just told your sergeant what you wanted to do. Hey, I'm going to bring so-and-so with me on shift, and then you would do it. It wouldn't be a problem. And then, since they were someone that you brought, if they started to bug you or they got bored or whatever, you could always run them back to the station and say, okay, go home. We're done. Well, there's one day that a girl that I was dating asked if she could go do a ride-along for the first part of my shift, which was totally cool with me. She's a lot of fun, super nice gal, and, she usually wouldn't stay the whole shift anyway, so it was just kind of a win-win. Well, while we were dating, I think she did this a couple of times, but I will say this one I'm going to talk about was probably the last ride-along she did ever, at least it was with me. Well, I was working that late night shift on the weekends. I think it was starting around 5 or 6 p.m. So she comes to the station after a little while, and they kind of wait for you, and then I went back and picked her up in between calls. And things are cool for the first hour or so. There's some usual calls, nothing too crazy, and we're just, having a nice time chit-chatting and driving around and hitting a few calls. Well, there's an ATL, or an attempt to locate, that kicked out over the radio about a homicide suspect from the nearby Indian reservation. So this Indian reservation is maybe a mile away from our city at the nearest point. The ATL gives a brief description of the person, the vehicle, and the crime he's wanted for, so we can watch for them coming into our city. And in this case, this guy had shot and killed another guy on the res, maybe, a day or so prior, and they just located him driving in a pickup truck. And the reservations are odd for law enforcement. Normally, if we get into a pursuit or chasing down a felon, we just go into our neighboring cities and continue to take care of business. And when there was time, and there almost always was for pursuits, we'd give the agency a courtesy call and try to keep them up to date as much as possible. And there was almost always good cooperation between the agencies on things like this, and we'd always offer our assistance and vice versa. Because you got to remember, we're peace officers for the whole state of Arizona, not just the city or the town that you work for, so you have jurisdiction and powers of arrest statewide. And this allows you to pursue your investigations and criminals and whatever you need to do, as long as it's within the state. Well, with the reservations, it doesn't work that way. The reservations are their own sovereign nation, so we have no jurisdiction at all once we enter. So if anything bleeds onto the reservations, such as a vehicle pursuit or just a continuation of an investigation, well, we have to get permission to enter from their government/police agency. And they do the same if something comes into our jurisdiction, but I will say it's usually a much easier process res to us versus us to the res. And I don't know how things are now, but back then it usually worked out the right way. So back to this ATL. Well, I'm already thinking, well, it's nothing I can do because I got this girlfriend/ride-along with me, damn it. But, as I keep listening and info continues to be put out, the guy is pretty near my beat and he's getting closer. And I believe that the reservation police were following his vehicle, but they were in unmarked or plain vehicles, so they really couldn't perform a proper or a safe high-risk vehicle stop. Well, now I've got a dilemma. So I've got this ride-along. I brought her, but they, being supervision, tells you to drive in the opposite direction in circumstances like this so that it lessens the chance that you'll get involved. Well, it's just not that easy to do, I have to say, but, and this is kind of what you signed up to do. It's your job. So I figured I'd compromise a little bit. I just kept driving in that general direction, but I wasn't speeding or really trying to hurry. I just thought maybe I should be in the general vicinity if it kept coming that way. And there's still plenty of time for the vehicle to change direction or get through my general area before I even got there. So I guess maybe not so much a compromise, but I did make an effort. And there is concern for my girlfriend. Of course, I didn't want to endanger her or worse, get her hurt. I cared for her. But on the other hand, this is one of the most exciting things that a ride-along could see. So, even listening to the radio chatter building up was pretty cool. And I could see it was, she was thinking it was kind of cool herself. Well, I'll tell you, that homicide suspect just kept driving toward where I happened to be. It was like the guy was trying to get me involved. And I'm laughing as I tell my girlfriend that it's starting to look like, we may end up getting involved in this after all. And I'd been downplaying it, saying, oh, there's no way anything's going to happen with us. I can't get involved. And so, by this point, I'm kind of like, well, hey, are you okay with that? And, she's supportive and maybe not so crazy about it, but she's supportive. She knows it's my job and it's something I want to do. Well, the biggest issue at that point was there were no other units near enough to begin to make the stop quickly. They were coming, but in a situation like that, we want to really get some units on this vehicle and try to get it stopped as soon as possible, because at any minute, these res cops or whoever the cops happen to be that are following him could lose this guy, or he could, stomp on it and take off. Maybe somebody gets hurt. You just never know. Well, as it would just happen, the guy is literally driving toward me on the same major road, as in I see the vehicle approaching me now. And so I make the decision that, well, I've got to initiate the stop. And I knew there was at least one other unit that was getting pretty close. So hopefully, if the guy stops, I should have backup there within, 30, 45 seconds or so. Well, I confirmed the vehicle's the right one on the radio, and as is also evidenced by the hard stare from this guy in my direction when I get so close to him. And, that alone tells you, yeah, I'm your guy. I'm the one you need to stop. Well, I get positioned behind him and tell dispatch where I'm at and that I'm going to go ahead and initiate the stop. Dispatch acknowledges, and the other couple of units give me a rough guesstimate on their arrival to get there and help out. Well, I hit the overheads at the point where if he complies, he's going to pull into, or he'll likely pull into an industrial complex. And I'm hoping that this will help to minimize anybody getting hurt if the guy starts to crank off rounds or takes off or anything silly. And, the whole time I'm watching his movements, where he's looking, I'm watching traffic, I'm watching his vehicle, I'm watching just everything. Well, the guy pulls to the right and then pulls right into that industrial complex, just like I was hoping he'd do. So I'm thinking, okay, at least that went right. Well, right as we turn that corner into that driveway for those industrials, and I'm about to stop the car, I take a quick glance over to my girlfriend and I say, hey, get down on the floor, just stay below the dashboard, and don't come up until I tell you that it's okay, no matter what happens. And then I kind of turn back to turn my attention back to the vehicle in front of me, just as I kind of see her give a quick nod and start sliding off the front of the seat. Well, this homicide suspect stops his truck and it looks like he's alone in the cab. I position my car for a high-risk stop. And this is kind of where guns are drawn and we give commands from a distance, and it's pretty methodical. There's a lot more to it, but this is definitely not one of those where you just walk right up to the car and go, hey, how's it going? So door open, gun pointed at the driver. I grab my PA mic and try to give him commands. And this is one of those, of course, moments because it doesn't work. I mean, it literally worked at the beginning of shift, but now it doesn't. Right about then, another unit arrives, flanks me on the right side of my car, and he does the same thing. Sets up, door open, gun pointing, and I continue to try to give commands. Well, the mic doesn't work. I end up throwing that on the floor, call it a name for good measure, and then I just start to shout commands to the suspect. Well, luckily it was quiet enough, and the gap between the cars wasn't too far, so he could hear me. So he follows. He does what he's supposed to do. He complies. He shuts off the truck. He puts the keys out the window. He opens the door with the outside door handle. He exits facing away, hands up, turns, blah, blah, blah. Well, eventually I walk him backwards toward the sound of my voice, and he complies completely. We get him back near us. We put him in a good position before another cop goes up to go hands-on and cuff him. And I mean, it just went about as perfect as a high-risk stop could go. And then once the guy's cuffed up, we had to go up and clear the vehicle to ensure that there's no one else in there, secure any weapons that may be laying around, and, just do a general check to make sure. So a couple of the other officers are just kind of finishing up with that, and my attention is still focused on the vehicle when I finally take the time to look over, and I'm like, oh crap, yeah, my girlfriend's here. I got to check on her. Well, I had to keep from laughing out loud because she had squeezed herself all the way under the dashboard. And I'm not just talking on the floor. I mean, she was like literally halfway under the dashboard where only your feet really fit. And she's a small girl, but I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it. Well, I ask if she's okay and hey, you can come out now. And she looks up and she's obviously a bit scared, so it wasn't quite so funny anymore. So I apologized and she was cool about it. She knew it was my job and she knew that I did the best I could. And she says that she was just terrified because I think the biggest problem was she could only hear what was going on, but she couldn't see anything. And I think that was really hard for her. And if I remember, I'm pretty confident that was the end of the ride-along for the night. And when everything was finished, I took her back to the station, gave her a big hug and a kiss, and she jumped in her car and went home. Well, and aside from that part, the stop was cool. The res guys are super appreciative, and they take custody of the guy. I didn't really get in any trouble. I mean, it was kind of a case of all went well, and it was overshadowed by how good we worked with the other agency. And, the guy literally was trying to run into my car. I got a bit of a don't do that again, and that was it. Well, my girlfriend recovered fine, and we had a good laugh about it for some time, as did our friends, but I don't think her parents are so cool with it for a while. Either way, she's a real trooper, and she never gave me too much crap for putting her through all that, among the other things that I did. So, thanks, Beth. I hope that all is well. And with that, I close this episode of I Barely Got Here. Thank you for listening, and if you like the show, please subscribe and post a review. And ask your friends to give it a listen as well. If you have a question or comment, shoot me an email at ibarelyGotHere@gmail.com, and you can also follow me on Instagram and Facebook. Sam42 is 10-7.